Hi, I'm Janika Ruuska, and this is my study journey. I'm studying neuroscience at the University of Helsinki here in Finland. In today's episode, we are going to talk about PTSD, so post-traumatic stress disorder. I hope you will enjoy today's episode. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Before we will land to the topic, I want to remind that if person is exposed to some traumatic event, it doesn't always lead to PTSD. There are some estimated percentages which tells us that around 70% of all people will experience some kind of trauma, and 20% out of those will have post-traumatic stress disorder. So how it is diagnosed based to DSM-5? So first of all, there needs to be exposure for traumatic event. It can be actual or threatening. And it can happen in several ways, which are following. First of all, it can be self-experienced, meaning it's directly happening to the person who is exposed to the traumatic event. The second way is witnessing it to occur to someone else. The third way is happening by learning. Learning that it occurs to someone close to you, to someone who you care. For example, family member or some other loved one. And the last way, so the fourth way, is occur through repeated exposure to details of traumatic event. So these are the four ways how a person can be exposed to traumatic event, which can be threatening or actual event. Then when this has happened, according to DSM-5, the person needs to have at least one of the following things. So meaning when person is exposed to traumatic event, it will lead at least one of the following things. First of all, the person may re-experience the traumatic event. For example, having nightmares or illusions, hallucinations, involuntary memories, so re-experiencing the traumatic event. The second thing, what may happen, is avoidance, so the person starts to avoid things. Maybe avoid thoughts or feelings, maybe certain activities, people's conversations, things which kind of reminds about the traumatic event. Third thing what might happen is changes in mood and thoughts. For example, a person might have lack of interest in activities or inability to experience positive emotions. Or it can be also that the person can't remember important aspects of that traumatic event. The last thing, so the fourth option, is that the person becomes hyper-aroused or the reactivity increases. And this means, for example, that the person has concentration problems, sleeping problems, irritable behavior, or maybe anger outbursts. So, the person has exposed to traumatic event, then it has led the person at least one of these. And to get the diagnosis, person needs to have two of the following things what I'm gonna mention. First one is that the person have had this more than 1 month. The second is there is clinically significant distress or of function. And the third one, that this all has happened due to event, not due to physiological effects of substance or medication. So all these diagnosis criteria you can find when you Google DSM-5, and it's updated once in a while. So as I mentioned in the beginning, many of us may experience some kind of traumatic event, but not all of us will get the PTSD. There are several risk factors, and few to mention. These can be, for example, low social support, family history or childhood history with a trauma, substance misuse, low plasma cortisol levels, genetics, which can, for example, affect to person has smaller hippocampus or hyper-aroused amygdala, and so on. But actually from here we could move forward and talk about brain areas. As I mentioned, amygdala, which is really important part in our brain when it comes to emotions and especially fear responses. So typically in PTSD, this part of the brain is hyperactive, hyper-aroused, meaning that it is kind of more active than normally, responds more actively. So when amygdala is hyperactive, in normal situation there needs to be something which kind of controls the emotional reactions. Medial prefrontal cortex is normally kind of making sense for the things, so kind of controlling the output from amygdala. But in PTSD, the activity of medial prefrontal cortex, especially part of it called anterior cingulate cortex, doesn't send enough this inhibitory, so suppressing the amygdala's activity. So it's not taking control over this stressful situation. Another really important part is the one I mentioned earlier, hippocampus. And what this means, hippocampus is really important for our learning. And if it's smaller or it's not working as it should be, the learning process is impaired. So these three parts of the brain are affected in PTSD or are not working correctly. So hyperactive amygdala, hypoactive medial prefrontal cortex, especially anterior cingulate cortex, and smaller hippocampus. Before going to neurochemicals, let's briefly talk about how the endocrine system is working in PTSD. Two systems are thought to be involved in PTSD, so they are working in abnormal way. One of them is HPA-axis and the other one is HPT-axis. HPT is hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, and in there the ratio between thyroid hormones T3 and T4 is abnormal. Maybe a little bit better known or more studied is HPA-axis. So hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And in PTSD, abnormalities in this axis leads to hypercortisolism, so lower levels of cortisol, and increased levels of corticotropin releasing factor. So normally, when we are exposed to some fearful situation, stressful situation, our amygdala sends the message to hypothalamus. And then hypothalamus secretes this corticotropin releasing factor to our anterior pituitary, from where adenocorticotropin hormone is released, and it reaches our adrenal cortex, from where the cortisol is released. This release of cortisol in normal situation signals back to anterior pituitary and hypothalamus and tells that don't secrete more, so negative feedback. So in PTSD, there are abnormal function of the HPA axis. So briefly about neurochemicals in PTSD. There is abnormal regulation of these. First of all, norepinephrine. Norepinephrine neurons can be found, for example, from locus ceruleus. And these neurons are really important for autonomic stress response. So you can imagine that function of these neurons, which are secreting norepinephrine, will be higher in PTSD. Then the second one is serotonin. Neurons which secrete serotonin are found, for example, from dorsal and medial raphe. And in PTSD, there is decreased transmission of serotonin. There is also abnormal regulation of some amino acids and peptides, and for sure other neurochemicals too. But let's move on to our last point. So let's talk about treatments. Before I'm gonna tell you some treatments, I think there is now a good point to stop and think what is happening in PTSD. So now we know the diagnosis, we know some risk factors, we know some brain areas, neurochemicals, endocrine systems where we have abnormalities if we are having a PTSD. But if we think about dysfunctions, what comes to our behavior, and which also could be targeted when thinking about the treatment. So before going to treatment, I will tell you a few of these. So, dysfunctions. The person with PTSD may have altered risk tolerance, altered decision making, reduced threat extinction, emotional dysregulation. And what comes to treatments, currently there are few options. Quite often, person may go to CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy. There are also so-called exposure therapies, where the idea is to trigger fear response, then it will be desensitized, and then ideally the symptoms of PTSD will decrease. But the thing with exposure therapies is that it's quite often, because the fear response is triggered, you can imagine how hard it is to go there, to decide to go there and experience things again. Then there are some pharmacotherapies, but quite often pharmacotherapies are also combined with cognitive behavioral therapy. What comes to pharmacotherapies, SSRIs are used to treat PTSD. This might have changed, I need to check it, because I checked this a few years back already, so things are changing fast, but during that time we had 2 FDA approved SSRIs for PTSD, called paroxetine and sertraline. Anyways, especially with the pharmacotherapies, these are not working for everyone, so the successful rate it's not too high. And that is the reason why people are all the time trying to develop something new to treat PTSD. And I will not go through everything what has been tested, because there are plenty of things what people try to find. But I want to mention few which are currently kind of a hot topic. So first, TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation. And what happens there is foil-containing magnet placed kind of here, top of your head, so we will not go into your brain. And the idea is induce electrical current in cortex. So this whole system affects your neurons, which are 2 to 3 centimeters deep. So when you go 2 to 3 centimeters from here, so to excite them. So as you remember, if the person has PTSD, the medial prefrontal cortex is not kind of active enough. So the idea is to get these active. The second one, which is really hot topic, is MDMA. There are several things MDMA targets and reasons why it is working as a therapeutics. This is a huge topic, so I will just briefly mention that one idea is to increase serotonin levels. As we learned, serotonin levels are low in PTSD. And MDMA is always combined with therapy. If I remember correctly, 2 to 3 times with MDMA, and then also without MDMA, the person will have therapy sessions. There came on this year one paper about this, a really good paper. I will put it in the description box. And if you want to check out more information, I recommend you to check a site from MAPS. I can also put the link for that. The current kind of hope in the field is to get FDA approval to MDMA assisted therapy in 2023. So let's see what will happen with that. Alright, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode and maybe also learned a lot. See you on next time. Bye.